Good morning. Good morning. My name is Tom Wright. I'm a senior fellow and director of the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our discussion this morning on is the NATO-EU divide an obstacle to European foreign policy? Recent events and developments, including the announcement of the AUKUS security pact, the US withdrawal of forces from Afghanistan, and heightened tensions at the Russia-Ukraine border have all prompted a renewed discussion of European strategic autonomy on both sides of the Atlantic. However, the role of the United States and NATO in European security remains a divisive issue, not only between the two sides of the Atlantic, but also within Europe itself. While some European member states, like France, advocate for the bolstering of European defense, others argue that a greater security role for the EU would detract from NATO. So how can NATO and the EU cooperate to enhance transatlantic relations and European security? Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by a distinguished group of experts on European security and defense to answer this question. I would also like to note that today's event marks the publication of a new paper on this topic by Giovanna Di Maio titled Opportunities to Deepen NATO-EU Cooperation. It is available on the Brookings website, and I strongly encourage you all to read it. We are very lucky to be joined today by Giovanna herself, who's a visiting fellow with the George Washington University's Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, and a former visiting and non-resident fellow here in the Center on the United States and Europe at Brookings. Benjamin Haddad is a senior director of the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council and has written extensively on European strategic autonomy. Christy Reich is a director of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute at the International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn. And Rachel Rizzo is a senior fellow in the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council. And welcome to you all. In putting this event together, we are very thankful for the support of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and for the respect they have always shown in regards to our research independence. Today's event, as always, reflects only the views of the speakers themselves. Before we get started, just a final reminder that we're very much on the record today and streaming live. So please send us your questions via email to events@brookings.edu or on Twitter using the hashtag NATO-EU. I don't know if that's controversial that the EU went after NATO or not, but I guess we can see in the conversation, but hashtag NATO-EU. So with that, let's get started. And Giovanna, congratulations on the paper. It's a really terrific, analysis and very, very timely. I'd like to start out with you with a couple of questions initially, just to get those ideas on the table. But in the paper, you make a strong argument for sort of continued and enhanced cooperation between NATO and the EU, and you sort of show practically and technically how that could be accomplished. Could you just tell us and the audience just a few of the major takeaways from your research?
Sure. Thank you, Tom, for the introduction. I'm glad to be here at Brookings in the presence of my excellent colleagues. Also glad to have completed this work, and I'm particularly thankful to all the experts that found time to guide me through some issues that were not just very interesting, but also particularly intricate. And just a few takeaways. I think this paper is relevant in the context of what's happening right now in NATO and EU level, in which these two organizations are working on their strategic documents. The EU is working on a strategic compass, and NATO is working on a strategic concept, both to be released in 2022. And I think those two documents, as I also elaborate in the paper, are going to kind of crystallize the tendency that has been of the two organizations to overlap, expanding their role and overlap in some areas. They were traditionally the main domain of the other. We will most likely see the European Union strategic compass us to discuss more extensively on how the European Union is going to build up, to plan build up its military capabilities. And we will see NATO looking at security throughout a more holistic approach, specifically having through the China challenge, the prism of the China challenge, looking at the domain of probably investment screening or even security of infrastructure that is going to be, that is traditionally the domain of the EU. And following the shock of Afghanistan and AUKUS, obviously there has been some pushback from NATO leadership about on this idea of European Union ambition on strategic autonomy. So that's what drives the paper in trying to see, like, is the EU strategic autonomy, or even like, is the EU military capability, increased military capabilities, is that incompatible with NATO? So the way I structured the paper was trying to look into how the two organizations have cooperated in the past. What are the mechanisms in place? There is a very good level of personnel exchange, but there is also a track record of military cooperation. In some ways, in some operation, things worked better than in other contexts, and obviously putting the accent on the fact that there is a single set of forces. Basically, both NATO and EU share the same forces for the member states that are members both of NATO and EU. So I tried to dig into this part, as well as looking at what hinders NATO-EU cooperation. And obviously the first thing that comes to mind is political tensions between member states that actually hinders intelligence sharing. There is no direct intelligence sharing communication between the two organizations. That happens only at member states level that decide to share information either with EU or with NATO, depending on of the operation, the specific situation. But that also slows down all the exercise that have been done to NATO and EU to respond to a crisis. Lastly, there is last 2 points on what hinders military cooperation between NATO and EU is a weakened posture of military that actually weakens the posture of the alliance vis-a-vis the Russia challenge, and potentially a combination of a Russia-China challenge towards EU. And military mobility, basically there is a very good study from Atlantic Council that points out how the regulations, some regulation actually hinder the ability of soldiers and means to move across the European territory. So lastly, what I argue that could be a good avenue for European Union and NATO to be working together would be leveraging each other's assets on specific domains, from the military domain, technological, cyber, and hybrid domain. And in particular, I argue that the European Union should leverage NATO's experience in procurement and identifying gaps in order to build up a better military posture and more effective defense, given the context of global challenges. At the same time, NATO could leverage the EU regulatory power to strengthen military mobility and also the response to hybrid threats in investment screening, security of infrastructure, as well as more generally in the hybrid disinformation and cyber domain.
Giovanna, thank you very much. That's very comprehensive and super helpful to get us started. I think many people will think the ideas that you have for cooperation are very both reasonable and important. But you mentioned and you talk in the paper about the broader context. There's always been political context. There's always been tensions politically over strategic autonomy or NATO-EU cooperation. But in recent years, we've seen Brexit. We've seen, the real deterioration in relations between key European countries and Turkey. There's the number of other, elements there as well. Obviously, when President Trump was in office, there was a US dimension to this as well, sort of seeing the EU as an enemy. How difficult, has that made this type of cooperation? I mean, if you take Brexit as an example, one could imagine NATO-EU cooperation being a means of of softening some of the harder edges of Brexit. It's sort of the solution to some of those problems, but instead, it looks like, the UK might have reservations about having NATO work with the EU because, they feel like it would violate Brexit in some way. So just, what's your sense of the political constraints, and how likely do you think it is that we'll be able to make progress on this cooperation in this political environment?
Thank you, Tom. So obviously, political tensions in organizations like NATO driven by consensus, obviously there are big question mark on how this could be moving forward. But as far as the political tension themselves and how the Brexit will impact this cooperation, first of all, it's important to focus on how the strategic environment has become close, like the strategic projection of both NATO and EU have come close, both in terms of China and how to counter China and Russia. And it's interesting to see that there are developments on the procurement issue with the permanent structure, the cooperation in Europe that just allowed US and Canada to take part of these projects that basically they're driven by the EU, but also enhanced in meant to enhance military capabilities across the European spectrum. So definitely the fact that the European Union is moving forward in its military capability is not meant to be an exclusive club with no openness to the outside. And also interesting to note on this point that the European Intervention Initiative actually includes the United Kingdom. So definitely the idea that the fact that the European Union may move forward a more centralized procurement raises questions not just in the EU, but also in the United States, as far as the United States potentially being cut out of the European defense market. But this could be, actually, there are several studies that point out how this could be avoided through also enhancing the PESCO mechanism, as we just recently witnessed, but also this short-term loss could actually turn out into a bigger long-term strategic, stronger strategic posture in terms of Europe being able to hold up against the potential Russian aggression that is the topic of these days, but also in general to intervene in areas in which the United States, there are no longer security priorities for the United States.
Thank you. Thanks, Giovanna. Ben, if I could start with you, I mean, I'd love to get your thoughts and comments just on Giovanna's findings, but also you've been in the middle of this big debate, especially since AUKUS on European strategic autonomy. I mean, I guess one question I have is, like, do you feel this goes far enough? I mean, you've argued for something broader, but or bigger, but is this a first sort of initial step or part of a broader sort of strategic autonomy agenda? How do you sort of think about it?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And look, I think it's a really timely and important paper because, one thing that Giovanna shows very well in the paper is that there's already so much that's being done in the coordination and dialogue between the two organizations. And I think, sometimes in the debate, we are a little stuck in the vocabulary from the 1990s. And, and at the time, there were some, I think, very important warnings from American policymakers over the risk of duplications and redundancies, the famous 3Ds from Madeleine Albright between European defense and NATO. And I think since then, European leaders and Americans as well have heeded this warning and put in place a series of mechanisms to make sure that there is actually value added and complementarity between the two organizations. And if you see, weapon systems that are being developed in Europe are interoperable with American weapon systems, you can see that the capabilities on which Europeans are focusing are identified as, gaps also with NATO. I mean, there's so much in terms of the dialogue. And Giovanna, you just mentioned the strategic compass and the concept, and there's dialogue also here that's taking place to make sure that the inputs of both are integrated. So I think we're in a very different place than we were, 30 years ago from a purely, we'll talk about the broad strategic picture, but from a purely institutional standpoint between the two organizations. I think that's that should also, you know, put us at ease when we think about, you know, developing European defense in the next few years. Now, when it comes to the broader strategic picture, I'll be honest, I don't think there is in Europe the sense of urgency I think that would be needed, given first the deterioration of Europe's strategic environment and the message that's being sent by American leaders and policymakers from 3 administrations in a row now, that priorities are shifting, of course, to the Indo-Pacific. I think it's, you know, if you listen to President Biden's speech during the withdrawal from Afghanistan, he is very explicit about it, saying that from now on, American military interventions will focus on vital national interests of the United States. And I think this, you know, opens an interesting conversation about European defense versus NATO, because it's pretty clear that Article 5 of NATO, that President Biden has called a holy obligation, would represent a vital national interest of the United States. If tomorrow you have a Russian aggression on a member of NATO in the Eastern Front, I have no doubt that there would be strong American commitment to defend this country with other NATO member states. But when it comes to security crisis in the neighborhood of Europe, if tomorrow you do have an escalation of the crisis in Republika Srpska and Bosnia, if you have another crisis in Libya or North Africa, more generally in the Eastern Mediterranean, I don't think you would see today the political appetite on both the left and the right of the American political spectrum to intervene on the behalf of the security of Europeans. In fact, you've already seen this in previous years with the crisis in Syria that severely stressed institutions of the European Union, from the migration crisis to the rise of ISIS and terror attacks all across Europe. And you've had 2 American administrations in a row that, you know, made a choice not to intervene and not to shape political outcomes in Syria, in a crisis that, you know, was seen much more urgent from a European perspective. So I think this is why with Max Berman in Foreign Affairs recently wrote a piece sort of making the case for a giant borrowing plan of 100 billion euros to invest in European defense capabilities. We can finesse the details, and of course it's more of a provocation and the debate more than anything else. But I think it's urgent really for Europeans to develop their defense capabilities and to have a serious transatlantic conversation about burden sharing, responsibility sharing, where Americans don't want to intervene and focus anymore, and where Europeans can step up and take responsibility. In this respect, European strategic autonomy, which only means the capability for Europeans to act and defend their interests and security on their own if the United States is not engaged on the theater, will clearly be an asset for the US and for the transatlantic relationship. It will not drive Americans away from Europe. On the contrary, it will show the value added of European allies to the United States. And let me finish just with this point. On issues where Europeans are strong, the relationship is strong. There is a process of dialogue. If you look at, for example, digital and technological issues where the EU has really risen as a normative superpower, as sort of a standard setter on the international stage with GDPR, DSA, DMA, we've created TTC. We've created a process of dialogue between both sides of the Atlantic because the United States sees that it needs to engage Europeans to shape common solutions. On issues where Europeans are not seen as key actors, such as on strategic issues, for example, we've had a breakdown of dialogue. And that's been the example over the Afghanistan withdrawal, where the administration did not necessarily see the need to let Europeans influence its decision-making or timeline over the withdrawal. So to rebalance this relationship, to make it stronger, Europeans will have to step up.
Thank you, Ben. That's very, very helpful. Christy, if I could come to you, and you've written a lot on this as well, but I'd love to get your thoughts on Giovanna's paper, but then also on what she said in her remarks, but also this broader question that Ben sort of raised of a more ambitious sort of European strategic autonomy. And I mean, obviously there are concerns in sort of Eastern and Northern Europe, on this. And so I'd love to get your perspective on just how you sort of see that debate as it's unfolded since AUKUS, and what some of the continuing concerns, may be coming from that part of Europe as they're sort of communicated to the United States here. And I think just you might be on mute. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Tom, first of all, for inviting me. Thank you to Brookings for this event. And congratulations to Giovanna for this very timely paper. What I think is really important in the paper is this comprehensive approach to European security. And somehow we all know that we need both organizations, NATO and the European Union, to take care of European security. And we have been talking about it a lot, that there needs to be better cooperation between the two organizations. But practically still, as you show in the paper, there are a lot of hurdles to having a better relationship, and it's a very valuable exercise to find for better synergies between the two. And we saw this boost that was given to EU-NATO relationship by the Ukraine conflict when it started in 2014. And yet now, 7 years later, we haven't made perhaps still satisfactory progress. And you point in the paper to some areas where we have had positive experiences, especially military mobility is I think, the best and most often cited example of EU-NATO cooperation. Cyber domain is another one where the relationship seems to be working better than in many other fields. But then what is much more difficult, for example, is the whole issue of capabilities. And somehow we are in a situation today where we all agree, the US, Europeans, EU, NATO, that Europe needs stronger military capabilities, and that's the most important issue for Europe to be more capable to take care of its own security. And yet the development is very slow. And on this particular issue, I think the EU-NATO relationship is also a very tricky one. And the reality is that for many European countries, and I'm not talking only about the Eastern flank countries, NATO remains the primary framework for capability development. And there are plenty of reasons for that. It's not going to change anytime soon. It has to do with our threat perceptions, and it has to do with the actual contribution that NATO still makes to Europe's defense, and then looking at what the EU contributes with its defense cooperation, security and defense policy, all these initiatives that we have seen in recent years. As you also note in your paper, they have not been making that great progress, less than expected. And looking at what the EU actually kind of contributes to addressing the most pressing security and defense needs of its member states, it's not that great. And the way I see, like, looking to the future of EU-NATO cooperation, I think that's one area where the EU and NATO need to find much stronger synergies to make the capability development processes better linked to each other, and to make sure that this rhetoric about EU defense cooperation, EU defense dimension also contributing to a stronger NATO actually becomes a reality, that we will have clear cases of the EU developing capabilities that are needed for NATO, that are important for NATO. And that's a very clear position in principle on the EU side, that anything that is developed in the EU framework is available also for NATO. It's available for both organizations. And of course, we all know there are no EU capabilities, there are no NATO capabilities. It's member states that have to strengthen their investment in military capabilities, and that's a key issue, key problem for Europe. And one more point I want to make as an introduction, and later I'm happy to get into other questions, is about these divisions that we have in the strategic thinking. You note in your report, Giovanna, that the strategic thinking of the EU and NATO has kind of come closer, and I think that's a very important positive development and the basis for finding better synergies. But I still have this sense, and AUKUS or Afghanistan did not change this, that we have bigger differences among European countries than between some European countries and the US when it comes to how we assess the most pressing security concerns and how we should be addressing these concerns. And I very much kind of share this concern that was highlighted by Ben, that we have increasing uncertainty about the future commitment of the US to European security. We don't see any signs yet of the US presence in Europe weakening, and actually we like to highlight in our region, in the Baltic states, that it has even strengthened. But of course, we have to acknowledge this strategic shift and reassessment that the US is going through, looking at its global priorities and commitments. And it means that there is a lot of work to be done among Europeans then to find a common understanding of how we prepare for this possible future diminished role of the US in European security and defense.
Thank you, Christy. That's fascinating. Thank you. Rachel, we come to you next. I mean, obviously, we'd love you to comment on Giovanna's paper, but just on this broader conversation as well, to put a little bit of an angle on the question. You know, you've been supportive of greater European capability, and there is this debate, that's been ongoing for a while, but particularly since AUKUS. What's your sense since AUKUS of where US thinking is on this issue, having sort of deeply engaged with France in particular? The administration has. They've also been hearing sort of these border concerns. They're trying to figure out how to thread that needle in a way that sort of reflects the views and interests of all of the different allies in Europe. Is your sense that there's a way to do that? And we'll come in the next part to the crisis coming down the track, but obviously there's a big train in the not too far in the distance here. But where's your sense on where we are?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. And first, Giovanna, I just want to commend you on an excellent and thorough paper. It was really interesting and fun to read. And NATO-EU cooperation can be not the funnest topic sometimes. So that's a feat in and of itself. But I think you did a really great job of talking about historic cooperation between NATO and the European Union on issues like, say, counter-piracy or issues in the Mediterranean. But you're right that there have always been hindrances to deeper cooperation. And I think, from a US standpoint, one of the most salient ones today is sort of this reckoning in the US, at least in policymaking communities here in Washington, about how we have approached European defense capabilities over, say, the last 30 years. And I think this sort of comes at a time where the US over the last couple of administrations has been pretty open about the fact that our strategic attention is going to continue to focus on the Indo-Pacific region. And I think, Tom, you mentioned AUKUS, the fallout from that decision, I think goes to show that the Indo-Pacific community of policymakers within this administration are really the ones that are sort of guiding strategic attention. And where that leaves our European allies, especially with this president who is openly pro-Europe, pro-NATO, and came in to office saying that he wanted to repair the US-European relationship, sort of leaves those two things at odds. But I would say that today, there is this growing chorus of voices within the policymaking community that are much more supportive of Europe further developing its defense capabilities and ability for autonomous action. I think looking back over the last, say, 30 years, there were probably two, in my opinion, the two most pivotal moments that have really dictated how the United States has positioned itself on this issue since, I think, the end of the Cold War. The first was in 1998, and Tom, you already mentioned this, the San Malo Declaration between Chirac and Blair, saying that they need to establish a European defense community backed by credible forces and action. And the U.S. Response to that was really swift. Just a few months later, Madeleine Albright went to NATO and gave her famous 3D speeches. There should be no duplication or discrimination or delinking EU capabilities from NATO. And that pretty much ended, I think, the EU's quest for autonomy at that point. And then the second time, I think, came in 2017, when 25 European member states signed on to PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation. And there was this, again, swift backlash from the United States. At the time, the U.S. ambassador to NATO said that they didn't want this to turn into a protectionist vehicle for European defense. And again, there was pushback. And so I think the United States is coming to terms with the fact that we have, in a way, contributed to the place that the European Union finds itself in now. And there's much more support from high-level officials, for example, Jake Sullivan, the president's national security advisor, going to places like Brussels and saying that the United States is ready to support this. What this looks like, I think, in practice and what it means for NATO-EU cooperation is yet to be seen, because there's always going to be these bilateral issues between member states that I think are going to hinder cooperation. And until we can figure out a way to not necessarily solve those, but ensure that they don't, hinder top-down cooperation, I think we're always going to have this sort of push and pull. But Tom, I do think that from the U.S. Today, there's much more support for deeper EU defense integration and deeper NATO-EU cooperation as well.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Rachel. I wanted to pick up just before we get to the Russia piece, because Rachel, you said something there, going back over the history of sort of the US role in this, and Ben mentioned, Afghanistan and Syria. And I guess the question I always had, and I guess, Giovanna, if you want to address this maybe with anyone else who wants to jump in, is capability is one thing. Figuring out what to do in a particular crisis is quite another, and to some extent, I think in the broader debate, we've been sort of hiding behind the capabilities issue, which is, if Europe had the option and it could have decided to do something different when the US withdrew from Afghanistan or in Syria. But I think the main reason the US didn't engage in Syria was because no one could figure out what the US should actually do in Syria that would be a successful strategy. Like, it was such a difficult, it wasn't sort of a lack of of interest in the region. I think, although there was some of that, it was just an incredibly thorny strategic problem that seemed to have no sort of viable pathway for a successful intervention. So let's sort of assume the capability is there. Is that going to sort of help, or are we going to have a whole series of different problems at that point, which is, trying to get agreement, not just even between countries, but within them on how to use that capability? I mean, I guess, Giovanna, the question is, are we seeing an emergence of sort of real strategic thinking in Europe that could sort of use this capability effectively? Or how do you sort of feel, what's your assessment of where we are in that regard?
Thank you, Tom. And thank you all for the comments and your insights. I believe that there is, probably we're not there yet, but that's what the strategic compass exercise is about. It's about the idea of trying to define a baseline of common threats and common challenges and how to respond to that. Obviously, as you mentioned, issues of crisis response, or like how to intervene, if to intervene in certain contexts, it obviously depends on the situation. I don't think there's going to be ever an agreement, even within one single administration, on what to do in certain specific issues. But I believe that having the option to actually intervene, or kind of, maybe in the case of Afghanistan, there have been reports from the FT about the UK, Turkey, Italy wanting to stay longer and like having a slow down the withdrawal of US forces, but like them being able to kind of hold up to facilitate the evacuation. Then in that case, that could have been an opportunity for on the European side, even though like UK and Turkey are out, but like in a similar situation, it could have been an option at least to operate that. And you're right, I think Christy mentioned the different threat perceptions that we have. Of course, these are not going to be solved today or tomorrow or next year with the strategic compass, but I believe that we've come a long way already in the assessment, both on Russia and China. We've been like, especially more Western European countries, more cautious about Russia compared to their Eastern European countries, and like this a similar their sense of China's threat, different assessment of Chinese threat that is not the same all across Europe. But indeed, I think the experience of COVID-19, the experience of Ukraine that now we've been digesting and it's coming back, obviously pushes to a broader stance and when we want to work together and actually what's our negotiating power. Because even in the Russia case that we're seeing now, the European Union is not at all, or even European countries are not the main interlocutor. Russia is talking to the United States, and this speaks to the fact the European Union is weak even in its own neighborhood when it's supposed to protect its citizens. So I think we're definitely those issues are there, but I believe the exercise of the strategic compass, as well as the challenges that are coming up, are gonna be an opportunity for Europe to think about its role. And as Ben was mentioning earlier, when Europe is capable, the domain that Europe can assess, establish its capabilities, then it's also an interlocutor. And with an interlocutor, you can negotiate and you can decide option. You cannot do it without this premise.
Thank you, Giovanna. And that's like a perfect segue, actually. And maybe I'll come to Ben next, and feel free to comment on that, Ben. But I think we'll turn to the Russia piece, because this is a crisis which I think is fast moving, and maybe nobody predicted, certainly a year ago, probably even sort of 6 to 8 months ago, definitely not the administration, which I think thought was working toward what it saw as a stable and predictable relationship. And with Russia, obviously Putin has different sort of plans. But what's interesting, sort of looking at this, there are a number of things. Number one, as Giovanna said, Putin seems to have some extent given up in Europe, and he's trying to Americanize the Minsk agreements and Normandy and the whole process, and sort of draw the United States in. I mean, that's one interpretation, you know, of what he's trying to do, almost reversing a pivot, you know, to the Indo-Pacific, because he sees that the US could potentially deliver. The other piece that's sort of obviously very striking is the prospect of a major sort of land war in Europe if he actually does move in, and if he moves in on a far greater scale than in 2014, maybe taking over the eastern part of the country. And the question that arises then is, you know, this will be the real test, I guess, of European will and capability, and whether or not that EU-NATO piece works very forcefully. Could you, Ben, maybe tell us a little bit both about how you sort of interpret what's happening with respect to the role of the United States and Europe, but then also what can we expect, you know, in the event of a major crisis in January? Like, obviously you would hope for a unified European response, but are you worried, you know, that President Macron with an election will be trying to, you know, be very active in maybe an independent way, and you might see a new German chancellor slightly unsure, and Britain doing its own thing? I mean, is this not in the EU anymore, but in NATO? Is this the moment where we'll see a fracturing, or will we see that unity at a moment of testing?
Yeah, well, first, just to pick up quickly on Giovanna's last point, because I really agree with this. I mean, you can't have strategic thinking without capabilities, because you're just completely powerless. You know, I love working in a think tank, but I don't think Europeans should be a think tank. You need to be able to at least have the capabilities to respond. And so when you look at, of course, you can have a debate about how to intervene. I think the reason the United States did not intervene in Syria was first and foremost because they did not see it. And by the way, Obama and Trump were explicit about this. They did not see it as a major existential security crisis for the United States. In many respects, it was an existential crisis for the European Union. You could even argue Brexit would not have happened without the shock and the images of the migration crisis of 2015 and how it reverberated in domestic politics of Britain at the time. So this is why, you know, first give yourself the ability to intervene, and then we can have the strategic debate. The Europeans are sort of doing it the other way around and publishing a lot of really great documents, but not really thinking about what we can do about it. So on Russia and Ukraine, look, first, when you look at the statements coming from European leaders, including from France, because you mentioned it in the question today, right now, there's clear show of unity, I think, in the transatlantic relationship, warning Russia of severe cost if it were to move forward with an invasion. My sense is that if it wanted to invade Ukraine, the Russian leadership would have already included in its calculus the cost of severe economic sanctions. So that's something that I think Putin would be ready to wither. It's been a pretty good year for him. When you look at energy prices, when you look at currency reserves, I think the country has withered already the cost of the different waves of sanctions that we've imposed since 2014. We're not talking about Navalny anymore. So he may see this as a legacy defining moment for him. You know, I tend to think that when someone says that they're going to do something and when they really actively prepare to do it, they end up doing it. So I do think that we should be clearly ready and take very seriously the risk of aggression against Ukraine coming from Russia. And this is where we need to have a real transatlantic conversation about how to increase the cost even beyond economic sanctions, but also giving Ukrainians the ability to defend their country, which we didn't really do in 2014, 2015. There was this debate in the Obama administration. So how can we provide Ukraine with the weaponry that it needs to be able to defend its sovereignty? So I hope we'll have this debate, and I think that's already the conversation that we're having right now, but at least signaling unity and the cost of action to Russia, I think, is important. I think the message that President Biden sent yesterday in his conversation with Putin, saying that an aggression would also shift the balance of power in Europe and shift the U.S. force posture in Europe, is really important, because if Putin is also using this to force a conversation on the security architecture of Europe, to try to give himself a veto over NATO enlargement, for example, showing that it will have exactly the reverse consequence, I think is welcome. Will that be enough? I don't know, but I think at least it's important to show transatlantic unity here.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben. Christy, obviously this is hugely important for Baltic states, and sort of a reminder, not that one was needed, I guess, of a continuing sort of threat from Russia. But how is this crisis being interpreted in the Baltics, and what's your sense of how Europe collectively, both at the EU and NATO level, will respond, not just in the deterrence phase, but if deterrence fails and Putin does invade Ukraine, what's your sort of expectations of how that will play out?
Yeah, well, first of all, this recent escalation of tensions, I think, again, kind of underlines that Russia, more than anything else, is an issue where Europeans need the US. And we have seen the crucial role of the US in gathering this collective kind of message and then position from the transatlantic community to make clear that we do have our red lines vis-a-vis Russia, to make clear that it is not acceptable to us what Putin has been asking for, to get basically a Russian veto over future NATO enlargement. And also it's crucial to have this very clear position from the US that actually the US is ready to stand behind Ukraine's sovereignty, and in case of further invasion by Russia to Ukrainian territory, that there would be severe consequences. So I think it has been quite reassuring, actually, to see over the past weeks how the US has made a strong effort to build this common position of the US and European allies. And thanks to this common position, I think today, actually, the likelihood of Russia's further aggression is a bit less likely than it was just a few days ago. The way I read the discussion between Putin and Biden yesterday is that the messages were clear, and Russia has constantly tended to underestimate the transatlantic unity, to underestimate Europeans, also to underestimate Ukraine's kind of resolve to fight for its sovereignty. And perhaps also Russia underestimated, or at least it wanted to test whether the US under the current administration and with all this strategic shift to the Indo-Pacific and also the domestic challenges, whether it would actually still take a strong and clear position vis-a-vis Russia. So in that sense, I think we have had a good show of unity, and more generally, since 2014, there have been several situations where I think the transatlantic response has actually been stronger and more united than anyone expected, either Europeans or Russians, and that's something to build on. And then again, when it comes to European contribution to addressing the Russian threat, that's where we have to, as Europeans, we have to work hard to enhance our contribution. And from my perspective from like the eastern flank of NATO, eastern parts of EU, that's one of the shortcomings of this discussion on European strategic autonomy, that in concrete terms, what is discussed there, it's very little to do with addressing the Russian threat. And it's partly because of the positions that the Baltic states and Poland themselves have been taking, because it has always been our line that the main issue vis-à-vis Russia is defense and deterrence. It's the responsibility of NATO, and the EU should not get involved there. And I think that's very clear that the EU is not taking over that responsibility. And yet I think we have to somehow have a more fine-tuned discussion about how does the EU contribute to the ability of Europeans to provide defense and deterrence vis-à-vis Russia, because I think that's has to be part of the EU agenda in order for this discussion on European strategic autonomy to be credible.
Thank you, Kusi. Rachel, if I can read to you just a quote on Twitter from Carl Bildt a couple of days ago, just I'd like to get your reaction. He said that Putin's launched his high-stakes game over Ukraine in the belief he can pressure the United States into a new deal over European security as Washington gives priority to the China competition. But this is sort of a line of thought that the new pivot, to Asia is stretching sort of US commitments, that the US will be compelled to make sort of tough choices. How does this crisis and a possible Russian invasion of Ukraine sort of alter, strategic thinking in Washington, where there is there has been, I guess, if not a consensus, a pretty dominant view that, the Indo-Pacific is the future and that would sort of take priority? And is this likely to see sort of a renewed US security commitment to Europe? And how do you see that sort of, playing out?
Sure. Well, first, I want to say that if I wanted a really thorough answer on this question, I would actually ask you. So not going to turn the tables there, but I'd actually be really interested to see what you had to think about this. But what I would say is I think the Biden administration is really stuck between a rock and a hard place here. We've withdrawn from Afghanistan. The AUKUS debacle is only just barely in the rearview mirror. There's no support in the United States for getting involved in another ground conflict. We've pivoted and are pivoting to the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific region. Ukraine is not protected under NATO's Article 5 collective defense clause. So there aren't treaty obligations for the United States to come to its territorial defense. I will say, I would assume that there are pretty high-level individuals within this administration who would probably push for a military response from the U.S., although I think those individuals would probably run into trouble at the White House. But on the other hand, Biden has said that there will be severe consequences if Putin invades, including harsh economic sanctions, removing Russia from the international SWIFT system. The question is, will these be used as preventative measures if it becomes evidently clear that an invasion is imminent, or will they be used as punitive measures in the event of an invasion? And if that's the case, I have a really hard time thinking that they'd be punitive enough for Putin to turn back. That's not something that, I'm not someone who understands the inner workings of Putin, like say Dr. Fiona Hill, but that just doesn't seem like something that would be on the table. So I think Biden is really in an impossible position here. We say we stand by Ukraine's territorial integrity, but there really isn't an appetite here for a military kind of defense, or we implement harsh economic sanctions that might not work. In both of those scenarios, European allies feel like they're not supported by the US. They feel like they're sort of being used as pawns, I think. And Biden's plan for a more stable and predictable relationship with Russia has utterly gone out the window. So I don't think there are really any good options here.
Just to pick up, Rachel, because you asked, I think I generally sort of agree, but I think the one sort of real wild card is that if a full-scale invasion happened and you saw Putin actually occupy Kiev, right, which is one of the scenarios that's been sort of widely mentioned, that he, believes over the long term Ukraine will gravitate westward. It's up to him to prevent this from happening. Only if he uses decisive force can he reverse that. It's not about Donbass or 2014 or anything like that anymore. It's really about, putting the Ukrainian government in its place and ending this for once and for all. If he were to do that, that has a dynamic quality to it, that it's pretty much impossible to predict in advance, right? So we have to ask ourselves, what would the fall of Kiev actually look like? What would the public reaction be to atrocities and civilian casualties as Russian forces ran through Ukraine? What would that, how humiliated would people feel? Like, what would the refugee flows from the eastern part of Ukraine be? And how would Poland and Romania and others react? And public opinion, as it did with Korea in 1950 and as it did with Kuwait in 1990, changes very rapidly, where the assumption that there's absolutely no way the United States is getting involved, sometimes weeks later, days later, it just feels very different. And so I think that is, none of us know the answer to that. I don't think President Biden knows the answer. Vladimir Putin definitely doesn't know the answer, to that. But my own prediction would be that, it will sort of compel the US to be much more deeply engaged in European security, because I don't think you can have a major conflict like that, right at the heart of sort of Eastern Europe, and expect that to just be, contained in some way. But I might be wrong. Giovanna,
Can
did
I
you
add
want to
something
comment
on
on
this?
Yeah.
Yes, please. Thank you. So I have a slightly different perception how imminent the threat is, but by saying that, I don't mean that we should not take the threat seriously. I just think that the dynamics at the border, like that push Russia, that Russia has been doing that all the time, pushing and pulling and putting pressure on Ukraine, and specifically to draw the United States in, draw the attention, bringing attention back to Russia from this pivot to Asia. Obviously, Russia is bothered by the reassurances that the US has given to, security reassurances the US has given to Kiev. And that's something that Putin has been observing for a while. Also, the military activities in the Black Sea, as well as these reassurances. So I think that the buildup, the pressure is there to push for Russia to push and gain the upper hand in what seems to him to have to Putin to have felt like a little bit out of control and too much pulling Ukraine westwards. So I believe that Russia is obtaining what he wants just by putting pressure. I believe, though, that troops are there in case something happens, so we should be prepared on our side. I just don't believe about this imminent threat. I just think that we need to be, as Ben was saying, Rachel was saying, like a unified transatlantic response, clarifying line. But I do see the added value of the predictable relation, the fact that they could hop on the phone and discuss this. I think it's pretty important. Although I don't think that there is much added value for Putin to precisely invade Ukraine. But the broader point is not whether or not Putin is going to attack. I think that distracts from the whole picture that is, there is pressure to US security reassurances and about on EU response. We also have not mentioned the Belarus-Poland border that also is a source of big instability at the borders of the EU. So I think that we should not really focus on whether it's going to attack or not, but more precisely what's going to be our response. And I think the unified transatlantic approach that we've seen the past couple of days, I think it's a very good sign in the direction of like, we need to be united. There's going to be consequences. At the same time, in every negotiation, the other part must be featured into this bigger calculus.
But Giovanna, Christy, we'll come to you in one moment. I mean, you would, that's very fair, but you would accept, though, surely that, I mean, if there are sort of credible intelligence reports, as there seems to be, that an invasion could be relatively imminent, then that is obviously something we have to take seriously, right? Because if past practice by Putin is not necessarily indicative of future behavior, so we, you know, just because he's used tactics for leverage and salami slicing, you know, encroachments upon Ukraine and elsewhere before, I mean, this time it could be different, right?
Yeah, no, I just meant, I said in the beginning, like the fact that the threat, like that he may not invade, I think the whole game of Putin and Russia is ambiguity. I'm not saying that we should underestimate the threat. I think, as I said a few times, I think we should be prepared to respond in case that happens. I just don't think it's going to be, not to contradict an intelligence report, but I think the fact that Russia has been plays in ambiguity may put us in a weaker position in debating whether or not it's going to happen. I think we should just prepare for the worst in general.
Thank you. Chrissy, and then Ben, and then Rachel, if you want to come back in. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks. I would also like to kind of stress this point that whether or not Russia is going to make a further invasion, it depends a lot on us, on the US and Europeans, what kind of messages we send to Moscow right now. And I don't see this as a kind of impossible situation, and I really don't think that Russia would go for an invasion in any case. I mean, it's clear that Putin is very much frustrated, and he sees that Ukraine is slowly but surely moving further away from Russia's orbit, and he sees that the means that he has been using thus far to stop this movement are not working, so he's looking for something new, and probably hoping that even by showing a very serious threat of further military invasion would be enough to make the Western countries to make concessions. But if the response from the West is that, no way, you are not going to make us sell Ukraine's sovereignty at this point just in order to avoid a possible invasion, but actually Russia has to get the message that the costs would be enormous, and Ukrainians themselves would be making sure that the costs would be enormous. But the US and Europeans also have plenty of ways to enhance the cost. It has been mentioned also in this discussion, the further sanctions, further military assistance to Ukraine. It is all doable, and it certainly has an impact on Russia's calculations. And when it comes to this possibility of a stable and predictable relationship, I think we should not be very optimistic there. I don't think Russia is kind of changing its strategic goals under the leadership of Putin. It will continue to push for a redefinition of the whole European security order. And the terms that he would like to achieve are just not acceptable to neither the US nor Europeans. So we need to find a way to manage the tensions, but this is not the time to enter into negotiations about a new European security architecture. I don't think we should do that with this Russian leadership.
Thank you. Ben?
No, well, I'm actually really agree with Christy here. There's an interesting passage in Kissinger's memoirs about the Kippur War in '73, where he says, we We had all the statements from Sadat that Egypt was going to attack Israel. We saw the troop movements. We had all the signals. Everything was very explicit, but it was still a surprise, not because of a failure of intelligence in terms of the facts, but in terms of the analysis. And because it seemed 6 years after the 6 Days War, so irrational to Americans or to Israeli strategists that Egypt and Syria could attack that they just didn't see it coming. And so I think sometimes when you have all these signals, you can have a different kind of rationality. It can have a symbolic or a strategic importance for Russian leadership that we don't see. I think European and American leaders often like to lecture Russia about what its interests and what its worldview should be. But it's clear that after 20 years in power, Putin probably has a pretty clear sense that he is right about his own country's interest. And that's something that we've seen from French policymakers, from American policymakers, and others. So, I would be maybe more pessimistic about the signals we're getting here. But I completely agree with Christy here. We have agency, Europeans and Americans, on the calculus. My sense is that Putin has always been sort of a calculated risk taker where he pushes, he advances until he finds resistance. That's also what happened in 2014, 2015. It's unclear how far he wanted to go at the time. But then we had the sanctions. Then I think clearly the cost on Russian lives in the Donbass had an impact. Even though Russia is an authoritarian state, you still have some sort of public opinion here. And so the body bag effect did probably force Russia to come to a standstill. And it could be the same here. So here clearly communicated the cost and the consequences to Russian leadership of aggression will clearly alter the decision-making process in Moscow.
Thank you, Ben. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, and we have a couple of questions from the audience. I'm not sure who exactly would like to take these, but the first one is on Turkey and just where, Turkey fits into this debate. I mean, obviously, Turkey's a member of NATO and not of the EU, but there's been significant sort of tensions between EU member states and Turkey. Ben, France is sort of at the center of this a little bit. Do you want to comment, or does anyone else want, Giovanna, maybe on Erdogan's role?
I see Rachel raised her hand.
Oh, I'm sorry, Rachel. Yeah.
No, I think what I would say is, I made a point, I think earlier, that when it comes to cooperation between NATO and EU countries, bilateral issues are always going to be a hindrance to that. And I think NATO's upcoming strategic concept that will be presented in Madrid in 2022 is going to try to lessen those issues as much as possible. Although I don't think that they'll ever completely go away. And one of the issues that the new strategic concept is going to try to tackle is, deeper consultations between members at a sub-NAC level, below the North Atlantic Council ambassadorial level. So if NATO can somehow find a way to, deepen consultations between, say, political advisors, capital to capital consultations, so that bilateral issues don't bubble up to the surface and create tensions at the NAC. I mean, look at what happened with the statement on Belarus, how Turkey really watered that down at a NATO level. I think when it comes to, those issues bubbling up to the surface, they do sort of make the fissures and issues with cohesion pretty apparent to states that might find that appealing. So look at Russia. NATO cohesion and fissures within the alliance, I think is something that Putin wants and Putin looks for. And so if NATO can find a way to make sure that those bilateral issues don't harm cooperation, I think that's what we're looking for, although we'll have to see where it goes from here.
Thank you. Anyone else on this particular question? That was from Jimmy Bash. I have another question that I'll just put out there as well, from Brian Burton, who asks, I think this is also an important one. What is the actual domestic political constituency across the nations or countries in the EU for real investments in the capacity for independent military action. So, you know, we hear a lot about, we all sort of agree on the need for Europe to do more and to invest in its future, but post-COVID and even pre-COVID, you know, there are many pressures on domestic budgets. You know, countries do have different perspectives, you know, on the Russian threat. It's hard to sort of convince people for the level of investments that are required. So, I mean, I guess, Ben, you've been, you know, to the forefront of arguing for this idea. Do you think you'll get political backing for it, or how seriously do you take these domestic constraints?
Well, you have theoretical political backing. If you ask a lot of European countries in public opinion polls, should we increase defense spending in the face of increasing threats? I think you're going to get a lot of yeses. The problem is, how do you get there? Where do you sacrifice? Where do you decrease? You know, I do think that there's a potential window of opportunity right now with borrowing costs being very low and interest rates being negative in a lot of European countries, potentially to invest more. But of course, with COVID recovery, there's other priorities. This is why, by the way, to go to a little bit of a arcane transatlantic topic, but that's also really critical, is American policymakers need to understand that to be able to get there, we need the development of an indigenous European defense industry, because leaders, political leaders, need to be able to point to jobs, to investment, to growth domestically if they need, you know, if they take from other budgetary lines. So I think that will be really critical. To put it bluntly, you can't ask Europeans to increase defense spending just to buy American stuff and create jobs in the United States. That's not going to fly in France or in Germany. Of course, you do it by being interoperable with the US, and that doesn't preclude American companies from competing in Europe. I mean, that's already the case. And I always like to remind people that, you know, Lockheed Martin owned half of the AUKUS contract, you know, including the AUKUS, the French contract with Australia, rather, the pre-AUKUS contract. So, you know, even the country that's pushing for strategic autonomy the most, of course, works very closely with the American defense industry when it needs to.
And also, Tom, if I can add to what Ben said, I think there is a great potential for the defense market to actually be able to boost not just on the investment side, but also the technological development of European countries. And I think that for one, this can, like a boost in the defense industry, can create jobs. And secondly, it will favor broader technological development that can actually be handled transatlantically. Also looking at the security of the supply chain can actually be a long-term investment for a country. So it's always not easy to sell these ideas to public opinion, as Ben was mentioning, especially given the fact that populist and nationalist movements are always active and not being completely sidelined during the pandemic. But I think in general, if we look at the economic trajectory and the benefit that this a particular time can actually promote, I think it's actually beneficial.
Thank you. Thanks, Giovanna. Christy.
Yeah, well, I would like to mention that we have a new government in Germany. And I believe actually the development of Germany's contribution to European defense is perhaps one of the most critical questions. And we have seen during the German elections and coalition talks how sensitive issue it still is, and how difficult it is in Germany to have a political debate on the issue of increasing defense spending. But it seems that the direction is good. I think the new coalition has given some positive signals about commitments to European defense, and both in the EU and NATO framework. But then again, the concrete question of the level of defense spending, the 2%, it's still something too toxic in the German discussion to be explicitly made. But looking to the future, and especially when it comes to defense and deterrence vis-a-vis Russia, imagining with different scenarios, possibilities that the US role will actually diminish, then Germany will be the most important country to actually make up for that change in the US focus.
Christy, thank you. We are just about out of time. Rachel, I think if you haven't come in this round, if you want to say anything, and Giovanna, if you've got like 30 seconds, if you want to say anything to finish, but no, obligation, and then we'll wrap up.
No, I think the only thing that I would add is sort of wrapping this back into our conversation on strategic autonomy and NATO-EU cooperation. With this new German government, I think that if the European Union developing and integrating its defense capabilities is going to come to fruition, the Germans do need to get on board. And this new government, led by Olaf Scholz, has said that European sovereignty, more Europe, is part of its goal as a new government. And so I'm going to be really interested to see how that translates into defense capabilities. The coalition agreement did not say that this government is going to make a goal of spending 2% of its GDP on defense, but it wants to spend 3% of its GDP on a more broadly defined set of goals, including diplomacy and development as well. So I think what this means for NATO-EU cooperation, strategic sovereignty, is going to be really interesting to watch, and I know a lot of us will be watching it closely.
Thank you, Rachel. Giovanna, a brief final word, or you okay?
Yes, just saying that. Picking up on what Rachel just said, I think it's now the ball is in the European courts about what they need to do and what they will do about their ambition to increase their capability for one, and then having a more prominent role in international security. And thank you also to your comments. It's been a great, exciting conversation.
Thank you, Giovanna, for such a terrific paper. Thank you to all of you, to Rachel, Christy, and Ben for joining us. I've no doubt that we'll continue this in the new year, hopefully in relatively boring circumstances, not too exciting a backdrop of geopolitical events. But I'd like to thank Agnieszka and all the team at Brookings as well for pulling this together, and also to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for their support, and to the audience as well for joining. And with that, we're adjourned. Thank you.